The sun over Deadwood that August was the kind that didn't warm a man, it punished him. It came down like something personal, like the sky itself had a grudge against everything beneath it, and the dust rose up in answer, thick and copper-red, coating the insides of a man's lungs until breathing felt like swallowing gravel. The gulch stank of mule sweat and unwashed ambition and the particular rot that comes when too many desperate people crowd too small a space and none of them intend to leave. It was into this that Elias Cutter rode, if riding was the right word. Shuffle was closer to true. His horse, a sway-backed grey mare named Agnes whom he'd had for 11 years and loved in the quiet way men love things they don't talk about, moved at a pace just barely above stopped. Cutter himself sat the saddle the way old timber sits a fence post. Worn down. Deeply rooted despite that. He was 63 years old, though he looked closer to 70 in the heat. His face was a map of choices, most of them hard. His hands were enormous, knuckle-scarred and permanently stained with the particular darkness that comes from years of ironwork, and they held Agnes's reins with the looseness of a man who trusted his horse more than he trusted most people. He came down Main Street at noon, heading for Halverson's Dry Goods, and that was when Cole Dredd stepped out of the Lucky Star Saloon and into the street, directly in his path. Cole Dredd was 29 years old and famous for it, famous for his youth, for his speed, for the 2 notches on the grip of his Colt Navy that he showed to anyone who lingered near him long enough. He was tall and lean in that predatory way, dressed with a showman's vanity, black vest, clean shirt despite the dust, silver conchos along his hatband catching light like small fires. He had pale eyes the color of creek ice and a mouth that seemed to find permanent amusement in everything it witnessed, as though life were an especially slow joke being told in his honor. He saw Cutter coming and didn't move. Agnes stopped. She knew trouble before her rider did. Cutter looked down at the younger man without particular alarm or particular interest, the way a man looks at a rock in his path he'll have to walk around. Old-timer, Dredd said, loud enough for the boardwalks to hear, for the men idling in front of the saloon to hear, for the women moving between storefronts to stop and listen. You look like something a coyote chewed on and spit out. You got business in this town, or you just riding through to find a place to fall down and die? Laughter from the boardwalk. The nervous kind. The kind that hopes the spectacle stays at a comfortable distance. Cutter said nothing. Dredd stepped closer, laid one long-fingered hand on Agnes's bridle, and jerked her head sideways, not enough to hurt the horse, but enough to humiliate the rider. Agnes shied and Cutter gripped the saddle horn to keep his seat, and the laughter came again, louder now. Get out of my town, Dredd said quietly, all performance suddenly gone, just cold fact left behind. Men like you make the place look tired. Elias Cutter looked at Cole Dredd for a long moment. Then he dismounted, slow and deliberate as a man stepping down from a church pew. He took Agnes by the bridle himself, straightened her, stroked her nose once. He picked up his hat, which had fallen when he grabbed the horn, knocked the dust from it against his knee. Then he walked Agnes around Cole Dredd and continued up Main Street without a word spoken or a backward glance given. The laughter that followed him was the worst kind, the kind that lands on a man's back like a brand. He didn't let them see that it did. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. He completed his business at Halverson's without incident. Flour, salt pork, 2 lengths of cotton wick, and a small paper twist of lemon drops he asked for quietly at the end. Almost as an embarrassment, he hadn't bought lemon drops since his wife Eleanor had been alive. And he wasn't entirely sure why he was buying them now except that they'd caught his eye and something in him had moved before his sense could stop it. He loaded the supplies on Agnes, lashed them down with the same methodical care he gave everything, and started the 4-mile ride back to his property on the eastern rim of the Gulch. The road climbed out of town and the sounds of Deadwood fell away in layers, first the piano music, then the shouting. Then the general clatter of human industry, until he was left with just the creak of saddle leather and the particular silence of the hills. which was not really silence at all but 1,000 small sounds woven so finely together they felt like quiet. He came up over the last rise before his land and stopped Agnes without meaning to. There was a wagon in his yard. Not parked neatly. Canted at a hard angle where one wheel had found the soft ground near the well and sunk several inches. The wagon bed was loaded with furniture, a rocking chair with a broken runner, quilts in a canvas bundle, iron cookware, and a steamer trunk that looked as though it had been through a fire and then a flood, in that order. A mule stood in the traces looking profound in its suffering. Sitting on the tongue of the wagon was a woman. She was perhaps 35, though hardship has a way of making arithmetic treacherous. She was dark-haired and pale-skinned in the way of someone who'd been ill recently, the kind of thinness that isn't natural constitution but loss. She wore a grey dress that had been mended so many times the mending had become the dress. In her lap she held a sleeping infant wrapped in a flour sack. Beside her on the wagon tongue sat 2 children, a girl of perhaps 8 and a boy of 6, both of them watching Cutter approach with the wariness of animals that have learned to be wary. The woman looked up. She had eyes the particular color of creek water in shade, grey-green and exhausted, and behind that exhaustion, something that had not yet fully decided whether to become despair. "Mr. Cutter," she said. Her voice was even. Whatever she'd prepared to say, she'd prepared it carefully. "My name is Willa Farrow. My husband was Thomas Farrow. He was," she paused, adjusted the infant, steadied something in herself, "he passed in April. Cholera. He told me once, years ago, that if anything happened to him I should find you. He said you were a man who kept his word. He said you owed him a debt." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not here to demand anything. I'm here because I have nowhere else to go and 3 children who haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Cutter sat Agnes and looked at the wagon and looked at the woman and looked at the children, who had not stopped watching him. He had known Thomas Farrow. Had known him well enough that the man's name in a stranger's mouth hit something internal and tender, like pressing a bruise you'd forgotten you had. The debt she referenced was real. Cutter didn't dispute it. He dismounted and led Agnes to the post by the porch. "Wheel stuck," he said. "Yes, sir. I'll pull it out after supper." He looked at the 2 older children. "Can you carry?" he asked. The boy nodded fiercely, eager to be useful. "Good. Help me with these," Cutter said, and began untying the supplies from Agnes's back. The inside of the house told the honest story of for years of a man living alone. It wasn't filth, Cutter was too disciplined for true filth, but it had the particular bleakness of a place where no one had thought to make it anything more than functional. The cook stove was grey with old grease. The floor was swept but uneven, the boards darkened with age. The 2 windows that faced west had curtains that Eleanor had made, dark blue calico, still hanging but badly sun-faded. The color washed out of them the way color goes out of everything given enough time and indifference. There was 1 table, for mismatched chairs, and a sense of accumulated silence so thick it was almost visible. Willa Farrow walked in carrying the infant and said nothing about any of it. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, taking it in with a quiet efficiency, then she turned to the girl. "May," she said, "see if there's water in the well. Take the pail." May, a serious-faced child with her mother's grey-green eyes, took the pail from beside the door and went without protest. Willa handed the infant, who had begun to stir and mouth the air with small hungry urgency, to the boy. "Hold your sister, Josie. Sit by the door where it's cool." Then she looked at Cutter. "May I use your stove?" He nodded and set the flour and salt pork on the table. What followed was a transformation so ordinary and so profound that Cutter had to go outside twice on pretended errands because something about watching it was difficult in a way he couldn't name. Willa Farrow built a fire in the stove with the ease of someone for whom fire is as automatic as breathing. She found his skillet, cast iron, heavy, buried under 2 smaller pans, and set it to heat. She sliced the salt pork thin, the knife moving through it with practiced economy. She mixed flour and a small measure of lard and water into biscuit dough and shaped it by hand with a speed that suggested she had done this 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. May brought water from the well, twice. The second time she filled the tin wash basin on the sideboard and washed her brother's face and hands without being asked, then her own. The smell of salt pork rendering in hot iron moved through the house the way good smells do, not just through the air but into the walls, into the floorboards, into a man's memory. Cutter came inside and sat at the table and felt the house changing around him and didn't know what to do with that feeling, so he folded his hands on the table and looked at them. The girl, May, came and stood beside his chair and looked at his hands with open curiosity. "You have marks," she said, meaning the old burned scars along the back of his right hand. "Forge," he said. "From when I was young." "Did it hurt?" "Considerable." She considered this with the gravity of someone filing it away for future reference, then went back to sit beside her brother. Supper was salt pork and biscuits and the last of a crock of preserved butter Cutter found pushed to the back of his larder shelf, hard and slightly waxy but acceptable. Willa found chicory in a tin and made something close enough to coffee to pass in dim light. She set the infant, Clara, she said her name was, for months old, in the empty bread crate lined with a quilt piece. And Clara allowed herself to be set down with the philosophical resignation of the very young, and slept. They ate. The children ate with the focused seriousness of people for whom a meal is not casual. The boy, whose name was Henry, ate 3 biscuits and looked at the 4th with a wanting so naked it was painful, and Willa, without looking up, moved the 4th biscuit onto his plate. And he ate it with the relief of someone reprieved. Cutter ate little. He was watching all of it. After, he washed the dishes himself because he was hosting and Eleanor had taught him that. Willa sat nursing Clara by the stove's warmth. The children were falling asleep against each other on the bench. "The back room was my wife's sewing room," Cutter said, his back to her, his hands in the wash water. "There's a bed frame. No mattress. But quilt's enough. That will do fine." He turned. "The debt I owed Thomas Farrow," he said, carefully. "I don't intend to insult you with details about what it was. Only to say that it was real, and my settling it isn't charity. It's obligation. There's a difference in those two things." Willa looked at him for a moment. Something in her face that had been held very tightly eased a fraction. "Yes," she said. "There is." He put the paper twist of lemon drops on the table before he went to the barn to sleep. He didn't explain them. She looked at them but didn't ask. 10 days after Willa Farrow's wagon had canted itself into the soft earth beside Cutter's well, Deadwood had already formed its opinions. And Deadwood's opinions were loud in the way of opinions held by people with too much proximity and not enough occupation. The clearest voice belonged to Reverend Aldous Strunk, a man whose piety was well established and whose charity was somewhat more selective in its application. He was a blocky, red-faced man with side whiskers the color of old straw, and he held the peculiar certainty of someone who has never been seriously tested by life and has mistaken this for virtue. The occasion that brought matters to a visible point was the Saturday trading day, when Cutter loaded the wagon, his own wagon. The one that actually rolled, with Willa and the children, and drove the 4 miles into Deadwood to resupply and to give the children the particular small pleasure of seeing a town. They made an unlikely assembly. Cutter on the board, straight-backed and silent as timber. Willa beside him holding Clara, composed and watchful. May and Henry in the wagon bed, May with her arms around her knees, Henry trying to see everything at once and nearly falling over the side with the effort. They drew attention before they'd fully stopped. Cutter tied the team at Halverson's and helped Willa down, and they went in to do their business. Halverson himself, a small, careful man who kept his own counsel and ran a clean operation, weighed their flour and salt and didn't say anything objectionable. It was coming out of Halverson's that Strunk appeared, with 2 of his particular associates, Martha Hollis, who ran the boarding house and knew everything about everyone, and her husband Gerald, who mostly agreed with whatever she said and added a periodic murmur of confirmation that served as his contribution to conversation. "Mr. Cutter," Strunk said, blocking the boardwalk not quite intentionally and yet not quite accidentally. He looked at Willa with the particular examination that men of his type apply to women of Willa's situation. And this would be the woman staying at your property. This is Mrs. Willa Farrow, Cutter said. Thomas Farrow's widow. Yes, Strunk said. I'd heard of Mrs. Farrow's arrival. The pause before arrival did considerable work. And the children. Another look, this one toward the children who stood behind their mother. I wanted to say only, Mr. Cutter, that the congregation has remarked upon the arrangement. We are a community that holds itself to a standard of Christian order. A widow living under a single man's roof, without formal arrangement, it does raise a concern. Martha Hollis added, people are talking. You understand. I understand what people do instead of working, Cutter said. Gerald Hollis murmured agreement, then caught himself. The concern, Strunk pressed on, with the tenacity of a man who believes his own comfort to be a moral imperative, is for appearances. For the example set to others. I would ask you to consider, Reverend, Willa said. She said it quietly. But something in the quality of it stopped Strunk mid-sentence the way a hand on a bridle stops a horse. She was looking at him with those grey-green creek water eyes, and there was nothing in them that could be called anger. It was something older and more fundamental than anger. It was the look of a woman who has buried a husband and kept 3 children alive through a Great Plain spring and driven a failing wagon for miles into a town full of strangers and who has, in consequence, run entirely out of tolerance for nonsense delivered in the costume of virtue. I spent 4 days in a wagon with my children, she said, before we arrived at Mr. Cutter's. My youngest daughter was ill with a fever for 2 of those 4 days, and I didn't know if she'd live. Mr. Cutter has given us shelter and food and treated my children with more kindness than they have seen from any stranger in the month since their father died. She paused. One pause. I don't know what you'd have me do instead. But if you have a specific suggestion that will keep 3 children warm and fed, I will hear it with a genuinely open mind. Strunk opened his mouth. Otherwise, she said, I'd be obliged if you'd step aside. I need to get to the dry goods. A long moment passed. Gerald Hollis murmured something. Strunk stepped aside. Later, while Willa was inside making her selections and Henry had his nose pressed against the glass of a display case studying a pocketknife with the reverence of a pilgrim before a relic. Cutter stood on the boardwalk and May came to stand beside him. They looked at the street together. That man didn't like us, May said. No. Because Mama's living at your house. Yes. She thought about this with the thoroughness she applied to everything. Is that going to be a problem? Cutter looked down at her. It's going to be addressed, he said. That's different from a problem. She seemed to find this acceptable. She put her hand in her dress pocket, where she kept the single lemon drop she'd taken 9 days ago and had not yet eaten, as though it were a coin she was saving for the right moment. On the way back through town, heading for the wagon, they passed the Lucky Star Saloon. Cutter had not forgotten Cold Dread and did not intend to. But dread wasn't in evidence, and there was enough else occupying the day that he set it aside for later, which is what a practical man does with trouble he cannot yet address. What he did not know, and what no one in Deadwood yet knew, was that a rider had come in from the south an hour before noon and ridden through town without stopping and continued east. And his pale eyes had noted the wagon outside Halverson's as he passed. Cutter slept in the barn. This had been his arrangement from the first night and he saw no reason to rearrange it. He'd put a reasonable bed in the tack room, a corn husk mattress he'd been meaning to replace and had now actually replaced. Stuffing it fresh, and he slept there with Agnes's warmth nearby and the particular smell of hay and horse that he'd found more genuinely restful than any bedroom for most of his adult life. He woke at what his body told him was somewhere past midnight. He had no clock, but he'd spent 63 years paying attention to the quality of darkness, and this darkness had the weight of late hours. He lay still a moment, listening in the way a careful man listens, not for something specific but for the wrongness in the general composition of sounds that tells you something is altered. Agnes was awake. He could tell by the change in her breathing, the quiet, alert lifting from sleep. She wasn't frightened, not yet, but she was attending. He rose without lighting a lamp, dressed in the dark, pulled on his boots, and took the rifle, a Winchester 73 that he kept loaded and propped in the corner of the tack room because in his experience a man with a rifle he has to go find is worse armed than a man with nothing. He moved through the barn and out the side door into the warm dark of the August night. The moon was 3/4 full and the yard was silver and shadow. He moved along the barn wall, keeping in shadow, and stopped at the corner. He looked toward the house. There was a man on the porch. Not Cole Dredd, this was someone shorter, heavier, moving with the particular careful sloppiness of someone trying to be quiet who doesn't have the natural aptitude for it. He had something in his hand that caught moonlight, not a gun. A paper. He was trying the door latch. Cutter watched him try the latch and find it latched. He had fixed the broken mechanism 3 days ago with a new iron piece he'd made in his workshop. And it held now the way it was supposed to hold. The man tried it again. Then he moved to the window. Cutter stepped out of the shadow and walked across the yard. He made no attempt at quiet. His boots found the gravel between the well and the porch steps and it spoke loudly in the night. The man spun. He was younger than Cutter had estimated from a distance, mid-20s, with a round face gone pale under the sudden awareness of his situation. He had no draw on him, no weapon Cutter could see beyond a belt knife. And he held the paper in one hand and raised both of them now in the instinctive gesture of someone who would very much prefer not to be shot. The man started. I know what you're just, Cutter said. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, the rifle held level with easy practice, aimed at nothing in particular and everything in general. Who sent you? It wasn't a question. The man swallowed. Mr. Dredd has a legal claim against this estate. The paper is a notice of, Cole Dredd doesn't have a legal claim to this property, Cutter said. This property is in the Farrow name. Any claim against Thomas Farrow's estate goes to a probate court in Cheyenne or Deadwood, not to a man delivering papers in the dark on another man's porch. The man's mouth worked. You tell Cole Dredd, Cutter said, his voice so even it had a quality almost like comfort, almost like a teacher explaining something patient and permanent. That this is Elias Cutter's property in all practical terms that matter. And that any man who comes onto it in the dark again will be returned to wherever he came from in a condition that won't allow him to come back. He paused. And you tell him something else. Tell him the humiliation he gave me on Main Street is something I carry alongside every other debt I've ever been owed. I haven't forgotten it. I'm not in any particular hurry about it. But I haven't forgotten it. He gestured with the rifle, just a slight inclination, the kind that in its understatement conveys more than a shout, toward the road. The man went. At a pace that showed he understood the conversation was over. Cutter stood on the porch steps in the warm dark for a while after, listening to the night reseat itself around the disturbance. An owl somewhere up the ridge. Agnes settling back in the barn. The creek murmuring in its bed a quarter-mile down the slope. Then the door behind him opened and Willa Farrow stood in the doorway holding a lamp turned low. She had a shawl over her shoulders and her dark hair was loose around her face and she looked at him and then out toward the dark road. That was sent by Dredd, she said. It wasn't a question either. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Clara made a small sound from somewhere in the house and she tilted her head toward it in the automatic way of nursing mothers, assessing whether it required action. Apparently it didn't. He'll say there's a debt owed from Thomas, she said. There may be papers that look legitimate enough to cause trouble. I expect so. Cutter turned to face her. In the lamp's low light, the years on his face sat differently, not gentler exactly, but more visible, as if the dark had stripped away whatever performance daylight requires. You knew about this before you came. Her chin came up slightly. I knew there was risk, she said. I knew there was a man who would pursue it. I knew that coming to you was the only answer I could see that had a chance of being an answer. And if I'd turned you away. Her eyes held his steadily. Then I would have thought of something else, she said. I always think of something else. He believed her completely. Go back inside, he said. Fix the latch behind you. He looked at her directly. I give you my word. Whatever comes through that dark, it will find me first. She looked at him for a moment with those creek-water eyes. I know, she said. I knew that before I came. She went inside. The latch, his repaired latch, fell solid and true into its housing. Cutter sat on the porch steps the rest of that night with the Winchester across his knees and watched the road and the silver yard and the rim of hills turning. By degrees so slow they seemed impossible, from black to blue to the first hammered brass of coming light. By the next morning Cutter had a plan, though plan was perhaps too formal a word for what it was, more accurately, a decision. And the decision had arrived in the night hours on the porch steps with the particular clarity that comes when a man is reduced to essentials and finds the essentials remarkably straightforward. He rode to Deadwood at first light, before Willa or the children were stirring, and he went to the office of Tobias Kearns, who served as Deadwood's attorney in all the various legal arrangements a raw and complicated town generates. Kearns was a thin, meticulous man from Ohio who had come west in pursuit of opportunity and found that the West's legal needs were if anything more elaborate than the East's and considerably more immediate. He was fastidious in his dress and in his thinking, and he liked Cutter well enough on the basis that Cutter always said exactly what he meant, which in Kearns's professional experience was considerably rarer than it should be. Cutter sat in the chair across from Kearns's desk and laid out the situation with the same spare directness he applied to everything: the widow, the children, the property in the Farrow name. The promissory note claim Dredd was assembling, and the man on the porch in the dark. Kearns listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. The promissory note claim, Kearns said when Cutter was finished, tapping a careful finger on his blotter, is potentially legitimate if Dredd can produce a signed instrument. Frontier debt collection is irregular, but it's not without legal weight, particularly if he takes it to a sympathetic court. What removes the weight? Kearns considered several things. A probate proceeding that establishes the estate's actual liabilities and assets in proper order, that would force his claim into a line with other creditors rather than allowing him to pursue it as a private matter through intimidation. He paused. More directly effective would be a change in the property's legal standing that removes it from the Farrow estate altogether, such as a deed transfer. Or, Kearns stopped tapping. He looked at Cutter over his spectacles with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words from a limited and somewhat volatile inventory. Marriage would transfer the legal protection of a husband's property rights to the widow and her children. Mrs. Farrow, married to an established property owner with no outstanding debts, would be in a considerably stronger position. Dredd's claim against a deceased man's estate becomes essentially unenforceable against a living woman's husband. Cutter was quiet. I'm not suggesting it lightly, Kearns said. I'm suggesting it as a legal mechanism. I understand what you're suggesting, Cutter said. He sat with it for a moment. The morning light came through Kearns's single window and lay pale on the floor. Begin the probate proceeding. I'll have Mrs. Farrow come in to sign what's required. He stood. As for the other matter, I'll speak to Mrs. Farrow. He left Kearns's office and stood in the street for a moment, reacquainting himself with the world after the contained formality of legal consultation. Main Street was moving at its morning pace, or wagons, early commerce, the smell of someone's breakfast fire, and beneath that the permanent Deadwood smell of damp earth and industry. Cole Dredd was standing across the street. He was leaning against the post in front of the Lucky Star, which wasn't open yet, but which served as his station regardless of its hours. He had seen Cutter come out of Kearns's office, and his pale eyes held that assessment that he wore like another accessory. Cutter crossed the street. This was not in his original plan for the morning, but then, neither was it an improvisation, it was simply the next thing. And a man who has decided to stop walking around an obstacle might as well do it directly. He stopped 6 feet from Dredd. You sent a man to my property last night, Cutter said. Dredd smiled the empty smile. I sent a legal representative with a lawful document. You sent a man to a widow's home at midnight to frighten her, Cutter said. The document is theatre. You know as well as I do that a promissory note on a dead man needs a court to validate it, not a night rider. Old-timer, Dredd said, with the same pleasantness he kept in permanent supply. You may want to think carefully about where you're standing and what you're saying. I've been thinking carefully about where I'm standing for 63 years, Cutter said. I'm comfortable with it. He looked at Dredd without heat, without fear, with the particular level attention of a man who has already moved past the moment of decision and is now simply executing it. You come near that property again, you, or anyone carrying your instructions, I will meet it with whatever measure the situation requires. And I will have no regret about what that measure is. The men on the boardwalk were listening. This was not an accident. Cutter had crossed the street in full view of Main Street, in the morning light, because witnesses are a form of legal record and he understood that as well as Kearns did. Dredd's smile held. But something in it had to work harder to stay up. Big talk, he said. I'm not a talking man, Cutter said. That's what makes this worth paying attention to. He left Dredd at his post and went back to Agnes. He found Willa on the porch when he returned, in the repaired rocking chair, nursing Clara and watching the road. May and Henry were at the edge of the garden plot, Cutter's garden plot, which had been badly neglected, digging at the earth with the experimental energy of children given purposeful permission. Cutter tied Agnes and came and sat on the porch steps, which had become, in the past days, something like his office for difficult conversations. I spoke with the attorney this morning, he said. He gave her the shape of the legal situation plainly, without softening it, the probate proceeding, what it could do, the timeline. She listened with her eyes on the children. Then he said, Kearns raised another option. As a legal protection. Marriage. He looked at the garden. Not for sentiment. As a mechanism to move you and the children under a clear legal shelter. Dredd's claim has no purchase on my property or on my wife's standing. The silence that followed was a particular kind, not empty but occupied, full of things being examined. You be asking yourself to do a significant thing, Willa said quietly, for practical reasons. I'm 63 years old, Cutter said. I had one wife I loved completely for 22 years. I don't pretend to know what else life is or isn't prepared to offer. He paused. I know what I see in front of me. A woman of character and 3 children who deserve to be safe. I know what I'm able to provide. He looked at her. I'm not a man who prettifies things. But I would be honest with you every day for the rest of my life, and I would never raise a hand to you or to yours. And I would work this land until I couldn't stand up anymore. Willa looked at Clara in her arms. Something moved through her face, passing like weather. My first husband, she said finally, was a good man who made one terrible business decision and spent 3 years paying for it and then died before he could pay for it all. She exhaled. I'm not a woman who imagines the same life twice. She looked at Cutter with those eyes that had seen enough to be done with illusions but had not yet, quite, been done with hope. If it's honest, I can work with honest. It's honest, he said. They were married by Reverend Strunk 5 days later, which created a visible difficulty for Strunk that Cutter found quietly satisfying. The Reverend performed the ceremony with the rigid professionalism of a man whose theology and his prejudices have arrived at an embarrassing conflict, and he has chosen theology because it is, after all, his occupation. Martha Hollis was in the church and spent much of the ceremony rearranging her expression. The town, as towns do, recalibrated. The legal proceeding moved through Kearns's capable hands and established the estate status in terms that left Dredd's claimed note as one unvalidated claim among several. Assigned to a process that would take months and likely yield him cents on the dollar if it yielded anything at all. When the probate filing became public record, which in Deadwood took approximately 4 hours, Cole Dredd left town. He did not say he was leaving because of Cutter or because of the legal machinery now in motion. He said, to anyone who asked, which was almost no one, that he had business elsewhere. He rode out on a Tuesday morning with his silver conchos catching the light and his face composed into its permanent expression of easy menace, and he did not look back. Deadwood watched him go with the particular relief of a place that has been relieved of a presence it tolerated but never wanted. Halverson, restocking the glass candy case with lemon drops the following Thursday, told his assistant that he had a feeling things in that direction of the Gulch were going to be fine. His assistant asked what made him say so. Halverson thought about it, wrapping the thought in the careful paper of a practical man's language. Cutter hasn't looked like a man who's given up, he said finally. He's starting to look like a man who's starting something. There is a kind of healing that announces itself, that comes with celebration and noise and the marking of a moment. And then there is the other kind. The kind that happens in the doing of ordinary things, in the lighting of a fire before anyone else is awake, in the mending of a chair that someone will sit in without knowing it was broken. In the finding of a paper twist of lemon drops on a table and the understanding of what they mean without a single word being said. Elias Cutter had been a man living in the aftermath of love, inhabiting the space where something that mattered had been and was no longer. He had kept the house swept and the stove fed and himself upright and in motion, which is what discipline allows a person to do, but there is a difference between being upright and being alive. And he had known the difference and had stopped expecting to cross back over it. May ate the lemon drop the day after the wedding. She took it out of her pocket, where it had been for 3 weeks, examined it, and put it in her mouth with the ceremony of someone marking a moment. She didn't explain this to anyone. She didn't need to. Cutter saw it from across the yard and understood everything it contained. Henry learned to set fence posts that fall, and he set them straight. Clara grew, the way infants do, with the blind implacable determination of growing things that do not know to ask permission. The garden, turned and planted in the last weeks before frost, would not yield until spring. But the rows were straight and the earth was dark and ready, and anyone with experience of such things could look at it and know, come spring, this would be a garden worth mentioning. A man who has been emptied out can be filled again. A house that has gone quiet can learn, again, what sound lives in it. What humiliated Elias Cutter on Main Street that August gave him something worth protecting, and what gave him something worth protecting gave him back himself. Deadwood talked about it for years. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that quiet strength is still strength, that broken things can be made better than they were before, then share it with someone who needs to hear that right now. Subscribe, ring that bell, and I will see you in the next one.